Hi, welcome to my channel, Momming Abroad. My name is Ashley and I post videos every Sunday on mommy and or expat related topics. Today I will talk about my top 5 tips for bicultural couples who want to name a child together. If that sounds interesting to you, stay tuned. Tip number 1, consider the cultural norms of both countries. So for example, if you are American and your partner is Dutch, then you want to consider the cultural norms in both of those countries when it comes to naming your child. For example, in my home country, the United States, it is very common to choose a unique or trendy name. In many other countries, traditional names fare a lot better. For example, my husband's culture is Dutch. If we look at the Dutch culture, ingrained in the Dutch culture is this idea of doe normaal or be normal, doing things that are really far outside of the box or considered risky. That's just not really a part of the Dutch culture. Of course, there are outliers and people who do those things, but on average, most Dutch people are pretty mild-mannered and they try to stick within what is considered normal, and that definitely carries through to the naming of children as well. You don't usually see people with really outlandish names in the Netherlands. It happens, but it's not very common. Whereas in the United States, it's almost trendy to give your child a name that is unique and more out there, something that nobody else has. That's considered something kind of interesting or exciting in the United States and very commonly accepted. It is very normal to meet somebody with a name that you've never heard before. But in the Netherlands, they also patrol the names a little bit more carefully. I wrote a bit about the Dutch naming laws in a blog that I wrote a couple months ago. So if you haven't checked my blog before, you can go ahead and read that. It's mommingabroad.wordpress.com, and there I give some more details on how the Dutch names are governed by the government, basically, and how and where you've been restricted with your names in the course of Dutch history. But now it is a lot more open. It's not that common that a name is declined, but you do need to go before you get your child's birth certificate. You or your partner, you need to go to the city hall and fill out paperwork, and your name needs to be approved by government officials before you can name your child that. So you can't choose names, for example, that are considered vulgar or that are considered harmful to your child's well-being in any way, shape, or form. Hi guys, so while editing, I realized that I had accidentally deleted or lost my footage for tip 2. So here you get to see me with no makeup and a sick face as I give you tip number 2. Tip number 2 is to consider the pronunciation of the name that you are considering. So it is not just a name that you and your partner will be saying for many years to come. They're going to have to introduce themselves to so many people over the course of their lifetime. So that could be whether it's class attendance in the classroom or at a doctor's office, meeting a stranger at a party, or waiting in line at the DMV. And they're going to have to repeat and correct the people who mispronounce their name very often if you choose a name that is difficult to pronounce. So that is a factor to consider. It is not just something that you and your partner have to live with, but your child has to live with. And also, if you have older family members who come from a different linguistic background, they may really struggle to pronounce the name that you have selected for your child. So that is something that you want to consider along the way as well. Okay, tip number 3. Consider your child's name initials. So if you're choosing only a first and last name, then look at the first letter of both of those names. If you're choosing a middle name or multiple middle names, consider the first letter of each of those names and what they look like together. For example, in the American culture, it's very common that you put those initials on a child's backpack, or that you personalize certain belongings like a water bottle or a lunchbox with those initials. Whereas in the Dutch culture, barely ever do you use your full initials on anything, so it doesn't matter as much. So try to find out and feel in both of the cultures or all of the cultures that are parts of your child's life. What role do the initials play, and what are those initials? For example, if you have 2 letters and you have BS or BJ or FU, those are not the most positive things to have written on a backpack of a child, for example, or a teenager that might be a little bit more, they don't feel as good about it, they may get bullied or teased about it, so that's something you want to think about. If you have 3 letters, ASS or FAT, those just aren't nice things to have connected to your child. And sometimes they're not as obvious as well. Somebody who is living in Germany, if they have SS written on their backpack, that's something that in America you may think of the Secret Service, which doesn't really have a negative, it's kind of neutral. But of course in Germany that would be really bad if you had that on your backpack. Before we move on to number 4, I want to ask you guys, if you like my channel, to please hit the subscribe button as well as the like button. It really helps my channel out when you engage by commenting and sharing, and of course by subscribing and watching as well. Okay, moving on, number 4. This is to consider unintended meanings. So let's give an example. When I was a child, I had a Russian coach. His name was Vladimir, and one of his nicknames, or his nickname, a nickname for the name Vladimir, is Vova. And when I started using that nickname, because I heard the other Russian coaches calling him that, and my mom overheard me saying that, she thought I was saying the word vulva, which means something else, and she did not feel comfortable hearing her child say that word, and she had to find a way to explain it to me in an age-appropriate way. When I said, why not? Why can't I call him that? That's what the other coaches are calling him, and that's his name. Why can't I call him by his name? So that's something that you want to consider. Think about whether the name that you've chosen is connected or sounds like a word in the other language that your child is immersed in, and think about whether you're comfortable with that or not. And my last tip for you guys today is to consider the associations with the name. So let's look at the boy's name, Tristan. That is a classy name in the United States. It is a name that I personally find very nice. It is a name that I suggested as a possible future boy's name to my husband at one point. And he immediately told me that it made him think of a mass shooting that occurred in the Netherlands in the early 2000s. There was a young man by that name that was a mass shooter, and that does not happen in the Netherlands often at all. It's very common in the United States for mass shootings to happen, unfortunately, but in the Netherlands it's just not something that you see regularly. So anybody that was old enough to know about what had happened in the early 2000s, so definitely millennials and older, possibly Gen Z as well, they will think of, or most of them will likely think of that shooter when they hear that name. Not all of them, I'm sure some have forgotten by now, but many of them will. So that's just something that I no longer felt comfortable with as soon as I had heard that, but I hadn't known that as an American because I didn't live in the Netherlands at the time of that event. Also, for example, we were considering and discussing girls' names, and my husband had suggested some American girls' names that he had liked, but I said I wasn't comfortable with choosing those names because where I grew up, there was kind of a cultural connotation with those names as stripper names, which I know is nonsense, but it's still just something that I grew up with and grew up hearing, and I didn't want my child to have to grow up being teased or bullied or you know, made fun of in any kind of way for having a stripper name. Unfortunately, names in the United States, and especially girls' names like Becky or Karen, they can become really negative trends. So I like to focus myself personally on traditional kind of classic names that are not number one, but also not really out there, and not names that have a cultural tendency. But then again, a couple of years ago, nobody would have thought that the name Karen would end up being what it is today. So you can't predict the future. Any name can become a negative thing. So the most important thing for you guys to consider is whether you guys like the name, and these other things are just food for thought, things that I found helpful while we were naming our first child together. And it's something that is very difficult for all couples, whether you are from the same culture or not. It's hard enough already to choose a name that both partners like, but then to add in the different cultures, that just makes it a little bit more difficult. So I hope that you found these tips useful, and if you like this video, please let me know in the comments. If you want more baby name videos or related videos, let me know. Make a request. I do enjoy talking about baby names, and especially the different cultures and coming from different regions, so I would be happy to make more videos like this in the future. That's it for now. I will see you next Sunday. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.